Today I'm going to talk about genetics and do our genes really matter? So the first question I want to ask everybody is, how many of you have thought that there's got to be a genetic reason why you can't lose weight? Absolutely. And how many people can look back in their families and say, you know what, Aunt so-and-so is large, and Aunt Millie is large, and this one on my mom's side is large, and so there must be a genetic link to that, right? And how many of you have been poo-pooed by that thought and just said, oh, that doesn't matter, just eat less and exercise more? We've all heard that, right? Well, I'm here to tell you today that that may not be the case, and genes may really matter, but it may not be exactly the way we think it matters. So we want to talk about, with certain genes, how do we feed them? What do we eat? This is a food for medicine conference, so we all talk about food, and about now our stomachs are growling from lunch, right? So we'll talk more about food and make you more hungry. What if you could find out what your genes were like and how those specific genes responded to certain foods? That might be important to us, correct? We might want to know if there's certain foods we should eat or shouldn't eat based on genetics. And we know some of it according to celiacs. If anyone was just in with Dr. Reynolds' talk, there is genetic testing we could do to see if you're sensitive to gluten. But there's not a lot of genetics to tell us if you're sensitive to every other food that we eat. But there are genes that are available that tell us whether or not we should eat certain things or amounts of certain things. So one of the questions we ask is, does this matter on a cellular level? Yes, it does, because when you have certain genes that are turned on, and we call those SNPs, they can create a lot of inflammatory processes in the body. And when we cause inflammation in the body, we cause disease in the body. Obesity is a major epidemic. We all recognize that. But it's also a chronic condition. It's an inflammatory condition. And we all know people who have tried every fad diet, every new diet. They've cut their calories, they've worked out more, and they haven't lost a pound. Well, there's reasons for that. Some of it's toxicity, but there are some genetic links that can be connected to that. Lifestyle changes are helpful, and they're important, and we need to do them. But has anybody heard the term epigenetics? Okay, just a couple people. So we're going to talk a little bit about what epigenetics is, what that means, and how that can be applied to your current lifestyle or your current way of eating and exercising. We look at things in a system, and there's this new term called systems biology. So when we practice a form of medicine, we practice a form of medicine that isn't necessarily us doing a test, finding an abnormality, and saying, okay, we're going to give you this medication. We look at your entire biology. We look at your entire body. We look at infection. We look at inflammation. We look at, have you had immunizations? What's your diet like? What's your stress level like? How much sleep are you getting? Where are your hormones at? That's a system. Well, obesity needs to be looked at the same way, and it hasn't been looked at that way ever, and it needs to start if we're going to actually fix the problem that we have with this. So here's that term, epigenetics, again. Epigenetics is a way for us to measure your genes and determine whether or not you have a genetic predisposition to developing a certain disease or illness. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get that disease, but you have that potential. What epigenetics tells us to look at is if you have a gene risk, say you have a risk to developing Alzheimer's disease, that would be a bad thing. Nobody wants that risk factor. But more importantly, what that tells us is we need to turn off your risk factors so we don't ever turn on that gene to cause the disease to occur in the first place. So we need to know what to do to make sure that we decrease that risk and decrease inflammation. That's epigenetics. The role of a healthy diet is really important here, and we talk about it over and over and over again. Whole foods, that's the key. Less processed foods. Why is that? Well, processed foods are full of toxins. Toxins turn on genes. And if we're trying to turn them off, the last thing we want to do is be eating processed foods of things that we really don't know what's in it. We can't pronounce the names, right? Half the time you look at the label and you can't pronounce it, never heard of it. It's not originated in the nature. But we don't know what that necessarily does to us. Unfortunately, the people that we've looked to for answers, the USDA and the FDA, have told us these things are healthy, they're safe, or they wouldn't be in our foods. However, there's enough news media that comes out every single day that tells us that we cannot trust the FDA and we cannot trust the USDA. So the only people we have to depend on to tell us if something's safe is ourselves and our friends and our colleagues that know more than we know until we can learn what to do. We need to know that we need to support the immune system. The immune system is key to everything. And I think we've gotten away from looking at how important the immune system is on the body. If you have an immune stressor, if you have an autoimmune disease, something like autoimmune thyroid, hypothyroidism, that's an autoimmune component. A lot of people are familiar with that. If you have one autoimmune disease, you're most likely going to develop another one. You're very susceptible. Celiac disease, it's an autoimmune disease. If you have that disease, you can have another one. It's important for us to look at the immune system and not just treat the problem. The example of thyroid disease is a very common one. Everyone's very familiar with thyroid disease. The problem is when we have an autoimmune thyroid, most people only treat the thyroid. They don't ever look at what caused the immune issue to begin with. They don't support the immune system, therefore you can't fix the problem. So you have to get to the root cause of the immune issue. I'm going to briefly talk about a hormone called leptin. Leptin's been more recently looked at as a problem with chronic obesity over maybe the last 5 to 7 years. It's a hormone that can act like insulin, it can become resistant like insulin does, and it can cause a lot of obesity issues for us. And then we're going to talk about cellular repair. How do we repair cells? Well, we have to decrease the inflammation. We have to give you good nutrients from whole foods or from supplements. If you don't want to eat the whole foods, we got to put them in a capsule for you, or we have to put them in a liquid form for you, because somehow you have to get the appropriate amount of nutrition to repair the cellular damage. And unfortunately, all our fortified foods that we have that are, great for us are not fortified with the right amounts, or sometimes with a genetic predisposition, not the right type of nutrient that you need. So it's all about balance. We heard that this morning, right? It's all about balance. Does this mean that in order for us to be healthy, we can never go to Culver's and have that custard again? Well, I don't know about you. I'm going to Culver's once in a while. You have to have balance somewhere. You have to have something that gives you that treat, that makes you feel good. That doesn't mean that you have it every day. That doesn't even mean that you have it every week. But somehow you find some balance for yourself. And trust me, as you eliminate foods in your diet, when you do cheat, you're not going to feel well. And so you're not going to do it very often. You're going to be like, you know what, that's just not really important for me to do that. And each time you do it, you'll feel worse, and you'll feel worse, and you'll be less inclined to do that again. For those of us who are chocolate junkies, that means you can have that slice of chocolate once in a while, but do the dark organic chocolate. Do the healthier forms of bad. Try to do that instead of doing the McDonald's once in a while. That's not food. That's not good. That's not even really a treat. So if you're going to cheat, make it worthwhile with something good that you really like. I'm just going to go back 1 second here. The other thing I want to talk about is how do we scale our meals? Okay? How many people think they eat a really balanced diet with every meal they have? How many people are maybe 10% balanced? 20% balanced? 30? 50? Okay, 50% balanced, good. So what do we define as balanced? Does that just mean it's healthy? Does that mean we've got the right amount of protein, the right amount of vegetables? We've got our plate and the majority of it's vegetables, and then a small amount's protein and a small amount is fat? Pretty much that's what we're thinking. Here's what we want to do to call balance. When you have a snack, you want a carbohydrate with that snack, and you want either a fat or a protein. You want a short-term fuel and a long-term fuel. And when we talk about carbohydrates, we mean healthy carbohydrates. So fruits, vegetables, not necessarily your grains, but if you are going to do grains, do your healthier grains. And then you want a fat, so apple with some nut butter, or nuts and a fruit or vegetable, carrots or celery with something like a hummus, maybe. So that would be a perfect snack. For a meal, you always want one of each. You want a carbohydrate, a fat, and a protein, okay? When we get into the talk a little bit later, we're going to talk about which genes need to have different amounts of fat and protein, because that makes a big difference for us. So there actually are obesity genes that have been studied. Clinically, we haven't utilized them very much, only because there hasn't been enough research to say, okay, now we've got this positive gene, what do we do about it? Is there something we can do? We only study things if we can make a drug to fix it. If we can't make a drug to fix something, there's no reason for people to put money forth to study it in the medical world. That's the mindset. In our mindset of an integrative practice, that's different. So we do clinical research, but again, clinical research is very difficult to do. So although we have some of these tests available, there isn't large groups or large studies to say this works or that works, and partially it's because it's individuality. If you have a gene just because you have it, you don't know that it's turned on, so to do large group studies like this is going to be rather difficult. We talk about mutations. Remember the word SNP, okay? That's a gene mutation. So when we're looking at a gene that has a dysregulation, that's considered a SNP. And that SNP is what causes the problems for us. And again, we don't necessarily know if that gene has been turned on or not, but sometimes we can speculate whether it's turned on or not based on symptoms that people have. And if they have certain symptoms and you're seeing certain amounts of inflammation, you can then kind of get an idea that that gene mutation is turned on, and we want to try to turn that off then. So this is one of the first gene mutations we're going to talk about. It's called protein kinase C. Researchers actually uncovered this enzyme. They call it PKC beta for short, and this is responsible for controlling proteins in the body. When this enzyme is turned on, and it's turned on by eating high fat, it can cause rapid weight gain, and it causes you to crave more fat, so you continue to eat more fat and have more weight gain. So when we talk in general assumptions that fat is bad for us and low fat is good for us, sometimes that's true, but not always. Because if we don't know that somebody has this gene or has this mutation of a gene turned on, that couldn't be a problem for them. And then all of a sudden, you know, how many of us have heard, I was skinny my whole life and then I had children? Or I hit menopause and I put on 50 pounds and I didn't change anything differently than what I did before. Some of those instances, I suspect, are related to different genetics that people have that we never knew about before. Because for someone to be skinny their entire life and have one lifestyle change that has occurred, never changing what they've eaten or anything else, tells me that something was triggered, much like the celiac talk. Something happens, triggers it, and the body goes haywire. That's the immune response that we get. Alpha ketoglutarate is another enzyme. It's another gene that we can look at. In a study that was done with men, they actually found if alpha ketoglutarate dependent dioxygen, or FTO for short, had been turned on, there was an 87% greater risk in gaining weight over a 10-year period of time. It's a high number. 87% is a lot of people. And oftentimes we'll hear people say, well, I gained 5 pounds this year, or I gained 10 pounds the next year, and I gained another 5 pounds here. So it's not usually something that happens rapidly. It can be a gradual occurrence as well. Matrix metalpeptidase 2, or MM2, also can cause increased weight gain in women over a decade of time. Nearly 30% of the women found to be carrying this mutated gene, MMP2 gene, caused them to have a 250% higher chance of weight gain over a 10-year period of time. That's a huge number. We see it all the time. When we're manipulating our foods or genetically modifying our foods and we're not taking into consideration these gene mutations that can occur, it's very easy for us to see the weight gain occur with literally us saying, I haven't changed anything. You may not have, but there's no guarantee that the food that you're eating hasn't been changed, hasn't been manipulated, hasn't been chemicalized in some way that's causing these genes to be turned on now. S1 gene, this is expressed in the brain. And this enzyme can cause a conversion. And when this enzyme is involved, it causes hormones like insulin, leptin, glucagon-related peptides to regulate one's appetite. So if it's mutated and it's turned on, we can see the appetite increase. And when we see the appetite increase, we see more weight gain, obviously. But typically when you turn appetites on from genes like this, you're turning your appetite on for things that aren't very healthy for you. You're looking for sugar substances, you're looking for salt, you're looking for fat. It's those types of cravings that you're going to get. In other studies, they've been identified to being ineffective in a few obesity cases. So there are a few people that might have this gene that no matter what you do with them, even when you try to turn the gene off, the weight still doesn't budge. And that may be a problem. We don't know what to do in those cases. All we can do is continue looking for more information. The other thing that happens when you have this gene turned on is your satification is gone. You're not satisfied when you're eating. So you eat and your appetite's up, but you never feel full. You never feel satiated. So when people have that kind of issue, we want to look at some of these genes to see if this might be an issue for you. The plinth gene is a protein that's associated with a lipid globule surface. And this may be seen in the development and maintenance of our adipose, or our fat tissue. When people have this type of gene mutation, it's shown that they have 20% smaller fat cells. So when we have smaller fat cells, we have bigger issues. Okay. This also means that people who tend to eat a diet that's higher in fat are going to have more issues with weight gain again. So again, there's that negative fat intake there. The most common gene and the most easily tested is called the ApoE gene. This is the official name is alpha-lipoprotein E, or ApoE is the official sign and symbol. We know this gene more commonly for looking at hyperlipidemia, or high cholesterol. It's been used a lot to see if people have a genetic risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Hasn't been utilized across the board for just looking at obesity, but each gene makeup has a different mechanism, or has a different reason why we would look at it, and different dietary exposures. We actually have been studying and working with this gene mutation for about a year and a half now, and there was a nurse practitioner out in California who studied this. Her name is Pam McDonald, and she wrote the Gene Diet book. Worked with a large group of nutritionists across the country, including Canada, and created dietary regimens based on every genetic type. And I can tell you, it really works. We've seen some really fantastic results, and we're going to get into a little bit more depth because this is the easiest test to do, and it's the easiest to fix if there's a problem with it. You can do this type of test by blood. There's also a salivary test you can do. You can do a cheek swab to determine your testing. You can also do more thorough testing for genes. There's a company called 23andMe that does genetic testing. They test about 5,000 different genes. Very inexpensive. It's about $100 to do this test. You don't need an order. You can order it yourself online. They'll send you the kit. They send you all of the results with explanations as to what each gene mutation means and what your risk factors are. There's also another company called Smart DNA that can do your testing. A little bit more pricey. It runs around $600 to $700 to do that test, but you will get a consultation with a genetic physician, and they will give you a lengthy explanation of your genes and exactly what to do as far as nutrients and diet and things like that to offset that genetic mutations that you may have. So when we talk about going into genetic testing, we have to be very cautious. We can't just jump into this thought about doing genetic testing because there's a lot of severe consequences that come with doing genetic testing. You know, first of all, you have to be mentally ready for the information that you're going to get. If you happen to get a test result back that says, you have a pretty significant genetic mutation for a serious illness, you need to be mentally prepared as to how you're going to handle that and what you're going to do with that information. That's the first and most important thing. Secondly, you have to be aware that doing this kind of testing could potentially put you at risk for insurance issues in the future, both health insurance and life insurance. If, unfortunately, the insurance companies would get their hands on your tests, you could be at risk for either not getting coverage for insurance or very high premiums. So it's very important when you do this kind of testing that you think about that before you engage in that testing. And some of these companies that allow you to order the tests on their own is helpful because then you never have to pass that through the medical facility. And it's best if you're going to share that information with your practitioner that you don't leave it in their office. You can share it, but take it with. Don't give them a copy, because if you give us a copy, it goes in your chart. And once it becomes part of your chart and somebody requests your entire chart, the potential for it getting sent is very high. So just keep those things in mind when you're doing this kind of testing, because you want to be able to protect yourself when you're taking on these risks. The ApoE test you can do pretty privately. There are some places that will allow you to just do it as a number without a name, and then that name and number never get attached in an office. The 23andMe test is all done by numbers. It's not done by names, so nobody would know how to attach it to you if they did come across that information. So I'm going to just touch a little bit about somewhat of a controversial subject called fecal transplant. It's a new topic. We had a lengthy conversation in San Diego at a conference we were just at a month ago. But there is some validity. And I'll tell you, the first time I heard about doing fecal transplants was probably about 3 years ago. And I was a little horrified and thought, are you crazy? Why would anybody want to do this? And then the more I researched it and the more information that I obtained from it, the more I realized that there is a potential for some health benefits for doing fecal transplant. And because 70 to 80% of our immune receptors lie in our gut, if you have a bad gut and you've done everything to try to balance it and it's not balancing out, possibly entering new bacteria in from somebody else could be helpful. Now, how you get that into there is a little different. And we're not talking about drinking poop slurries or anything like that, because that would be a little bad. We're talking about doing enemas, or you can do homeopathic transplants with suppositories and things like that. But keep in mind, when you want to think about doing this, you want to make sure you know who your resource is. You don't want just Joe Blow down the block sharing some fecal matter with you. You want to know that the person that you're obtaining this from is healthy, has had a good diet, is clean, doesn't have any kind of risk factors, because potentially you could be introducing yourself into other risk factors if you're not careful. I'm not aware of anybody local that's doing this at this point. There are some people, of course, out on the West Coast that are doing this. So it's a new field, but you're going to hear a lot about it, so just kind of be cautious and tread carefully with it. When we look at doing genetic testing, we have patients that do a little bit of everything. We have people who have done the smart DNA. We've had people who have done the 23andMe. I've had the 23andMe done. My family has done it. It can be a little overwhelming information. It takes you a little while to digest it, but it can be helpful in a lot of cases for you. The ApoE testing is very simple. I wouldn't probably worry too much about doing that test with the insurance issues as much as I would worry about doing a full panel of genetic testing. So this is what the 23andMe test looks like when it comes to you. It's a fairly large tube, maybe about like this, about the width of your finger, that you're going to spit in and fill it up and send it off to the lab. This is the smart DNA, where you would go to order that test. And so more importantly, now that we know there's all these genes we can test, well, more importantly, what do we do about it, right? So when we work with the ApoE, there are many different diets that we can put people on, and there's about 17 different combinations of the ApoE4 that can come back. And the more important question is, does it really work? And the answer is yes, it really does work. This is what an ApoE gene looks like. This is a 3 type and a 4 type. 3 is your most common, 4 is your worst. You don't want to be a 4. So some of the diseases and risks that we see associated with ApoE4 are Alzheimer's disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, autism, cholesterol issues, hyperlipidemia, Parkinson's, and stroke. An ApoE33 gene is the most common, like I said. About 51 to 53% of the population is going to be a 3-3. And that's kind of a neutral, a moderate group factor. Those people have a moderate ability to clear toxins from their body. So they're pretty average, pretty normal. They should have moderate fat intake, and their diet should contain good sources of fiber. They need to know that alcohol does increase their risk for their bad cholesterol, their LDL. Omega-3 or fish oil support decreases triglycerides, small dense lipoproteins, your LDL, your bad, and it actually increases HDL for you. This gene type should also partake in 50% of aerobic and 50% of anaerobic exercise. And I've got that in the slide twice, so must have been important. So you can kind of tell with this gene type that they're middle of the road. They should be moderation with everything, okay? An ApoE4-2 type occurs in about 2% of the population of people, and they also have a moderate ability to clear their toxins. So that's pretty good. They can do very well with that. They should have a moderate intake of fat, but with strict limitation. So they can have a fair amount of it, but they don't want to be doing it all the time, okay? They need good sources of fiber. They should avoid all alcohol because it does increase their bad cholesterol and it decreases their good cholesterol. They need good omega-3 or fish oil support. It decreases their triglycerides, their LDLs, and it increases their HDL. And they should partake in 50-50 anaerobic to aerobic exercise as well. Now, a 4-3 is a little bit different. About 20% of this population has very poor toxic clearance. So when we get exposed to toxins with a 4-3, they cannot remove those toxins as quickly or as easily as they should. And so they need to be more proactive in removing their toxic load. They need a very low-fat diet and very strict limitations to a low-fat diet. And they should also contain good sources of fiber. They should avoid all alcohol because it also increases their bad cholesterol, decreases their good cholesterol. Omega-3 support decreases their triglycerides and small dense LDL and increases their good cholesterol. And they should be 75% aerobic exercise and 25% anaerobic exercise. A 4-4 is the worst gene type that you could have. It's the one you don't want to get. And keep in mind, you get genes, one from each parent. So there's a possibility of you getting just about anything. So if you're a 4-4, you're within 5% of the population of people. They have very poor clearance to their toxins. This is somebody that's going to need to make sure they do something to remove their toxins every single day. Sauna therapy, they need to sweat, they need to exercise, they need to make sure they don't expose themselves to a lot of chemicals. I would say things like IV glutathione would be really good for them on a regular basis, and every day they should be getting some glutathione either topically or they could use something called N-acetylcysteine to help produce more glutathione in their body to remove their toxins. Their diet should contain good sources of fiber. That should be number one. It's a strong recommendation for them to remove all alcohol because it also causes problems with their LDL cholesterol and decreases their good cholesterol. They can use omega-3s, and they need to partake in 75% aerobic and 25% anaerobic exercise. A 2-3 has a higher risk of actually having diabetes. I should probably back up a little bit and give you a little more information. A 4 gene is significant for cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's disease. A 2 gene is more risk for neurological things like Parkinson's disease, other neurological issues, and diabetes. 3-3 has a higher issue for insulin resistance. Any of the 3s have more insulin resistance issues. So back to the 2-3, this occurs in about 10% of the population. And they can have a moderate to high clearance of toxins. So if they get exposed, they actually fat diet. So when we talk about everyone should be on this low-fat diet, this is one genetic type we would say, no, not the case for them. They actually need a lot more fat in their diet. But they can't have any processed carbohydrates, and that's important. Contain good sources of fiber as well, omega-3 support, and they should have 55% aerobic and 45% anaerobic exercise. 2-2s occur in 1% of the population, and they have very high clearance of toxins. They also should have a very high fat diet with no processed carbohydrates. They benefit from low to normal alcohol use, so we all want to have that, right? We all want to have some alcohol use in our diets, and omega-3s as well. They should also partake in 55% aerobic, 45% anaerobic exercise. So here's a case study for you. This is a 57-year-old woman that presented to us. She had used the HCG diet. How many people are familiar with that? Okay, she had used the HCG diet 5-6 times. HCG is a hormone that we use for weight loss. Her goal was to lose weight. So she had used HCG, she lost some weight, gained it back, lost it, gained it back. We've all heard that story, right? But she finally said, I need to do something more permanent. My cholesterol's high, my blood pressure's high. I know I have to lose this weight, but what I'm doing is not working. What can we do differently? So we actually did the ApoE gene test on her, and she came back as a 3-4. Diabetes because of the 3 type. So we put her on a 1,200 calorie diet, 3-4 diet, which looks like this. It's 6 grains and starches, and this is servings. We do diet by serving sizes. So 6 grains and starches a day, 5 fruits and vegetables, 2 and 0.25 servings of 3 ounces of protein a day, and only 3 fats a day. This was somebody who was eating a lot of nuts, a lot of seeds, because it's healthy for us, right? And it has some protein, but it's also a fat. And in this case, this was doing a lot of damage for her. So we did this diet with her. After the first 6 weeks, she came back and she had lost about 10 to 15 pounds. We repeated her cholesterol panel after 12 weeks, and her cholesterol panel had been quite high. She had a lot of abnormal particle sizes, very high risk for cardiovascular disease as a result of it, a lot of inflammation. Almost every marker we did on her was normal by 12 weeks. She had a few that were still high. She had some insulin resistance that was still high. By the following 12 weeks, so 24 weeks out from her diet, she had all of her markers into the normal range. She had lost 28 pounds and was able to keep it off. And she was off her cholesterol medication at that point. She had gotten off of her blood pressure medication and was maintaining her blood pressure nicely and was feeling the best she has ever felt in her life. And she has been so grateful for this diet because it is the first time she's been able to actually change her lifestyle and have it be a permanent lifestyle for her that she is going to go into the rest of her life utilizing. So when we talk a little bit about evaluating our toxins, chemical toxins can be a big issue. They like to store in the body fat tissue. So we talked a little bit this morning about the PCBs and the other polycarbons that are in our plastic, they're in our cans, all of those things. So the more adipose tissue or fat tissue we have, the larger the place to store our toxins. So we want to make sure we get rid of that fat. We need to move those toxins. But I will tell you, when we move your toxins, you're probably not going to feel very well. You're going to feel achy, and you're going to feel tired, and you're going to feel foggy, and you're going to be emotional. And that's part of the course. And there are sometimes things we can do to make you feel better, and sometimes there's things that you just got to ride it through. But you need to move those toxins out. We can test toxic load. There are some testings that we can do for heavy metal toxicity. There's core testing by a company called Genova that can actually look at your chemical toxicity level and see how many of these PCBs and DDTs and all these things that you have been exposed to over your time, how much is stored in your body. It's not a cheap test. It runs about $600-700. But if you're interested, you can find that out, and then you know what you need to do to try to get rid of it. It would especially be a test that I would recommend somebody do if they are, if they've had cancer, or if they're at very high risk for cancer. That would be a test you would want to do, because you'd want to know what kind of chemicals you have in your body, and you want to know what you need to do to get rid of them. So how do we remove toxins? We talked a little bit about that. Glutathione works very well. There's a topical product called Oxycell that you can get over the counter. It's in a cream. It has a nice scent to it. Glutathione smells, if anybody's ever used it before, it smells like rotten eggs. So it's not a fun smell, but in this topical form, it doesn't smell like that, so it's pretty well. You can use it IV, or you can use it in the form of N-acetylcysteine and allow your body to make its own glutathione. Sauna is my #1 favorite thing. If you cannot do anything else, you need to sweat. You need to get in a sauna. The more often you can do it, the better. It will remove toxins, heavy metals, chemicals, everything. And the more often you do it, the cleaner your body will be. You need to make sure you're eliminating. Your bowel needs to eliminate. So when people say, I'm pretty regular, I have a bowel movement once a week, or once every 4 days, that's the way it's always been, that's regular for me. Well, that may be, however, that is not healthy. We should have a bowel movement for every meal we have a day. If you eat 3 times a day, you should have 3 bowel movements a day. That's a healthy colon, that's moving, that's eliminating toxins. So that's our goal, that's what we're trying to achieve. If you only eat once a day, well then you should only move your bowels once a day. So you can use things like probiotics and digestive enzymes, those things will help move your bowels. If you're still having problems with it, things like turkey rhubarb work very well. There's a product called Trifella that works fairly well. And good old-fashioned magnesium is cheap and easy and works beautifully. So our takeaway message is, what do you do with this information? How many people want to run out and have genetic testing done tomorrow? A couple people. How many people would think about it, or maybe do some testing but not others? Yeah, and that's the smart takeaway. For some of us, it makes sense to do that full panel. For others, it makes sense to maybe do 1 or 2 tests, and that's an individual basis that we have to make. More importantly, know what you're going to do with that information when you get it. Have a plan, have somebody that can work with you, that can help you adjust your diet, your lifestyle, and all those things to make the testing worth your while. And make sure what you do, you actually are going to put forth and change your life with it. That's the talk. Thank you.